the first thing I need to say is that the title of this talk came from Bob Jordan, of course. For those of you who are fairly new to us, Bob Jordan was one of our parishioners for many, many years. From the days back at the, let's see, Church of Religious Science, then to the Soul Esteem Center, and over then to, as it evolved, into the Mindful Spiritual Center. And Bob lived in the Central West End, and I, along with Kay Lasciuto, used to drive Bob to church because he did not have access to his own, didn't have his own car, and depended on public transportation for everything. And we would have long discussions about the implications of the Sith Lords and whether Obi-Wan Kenobi, and so on and so forth, and which was the best one. New Hope was the best one. Any of the prequels, you don't even talk to Bob about. So as soon as I got the request for a title for today's talk, Yoda popped into my mind, and one of the most famous sayings of Yoda was, "Fear leads to the dark side." And for those of you who have never seen a Star Wars movie, it's basically a hero's journey. A young man gets swept up into things that he never experienced. He always had dreams of being something greater, but all of a sudden a war comes along and special people come along the way. It's the classic hero's journey. And Yoda is one of the esteemed mentors to Luke Skywalker, who is the hero of this story. Is there anybody who doesn't get what this is? All right. Is there anybody who's never seen Star Wars? I think there's one or two people in this. It's two people. I hope I've given you a rough idea. Okay. So Yoda is an ancient master, and of course I like him because he's very tiny, but very mighty and very powerful. He's several hundred years old. And he is a fountain of ancient wisdom. I would say really he is a Taoist teacher, because a lot of his thought comes from the world of Taoist thought. And this is what he says: fear is the path to the dark side. Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering. And I thought, oh boy, that's such a heavy topic. But I think in today's world, we see so much fear-driven behavior and fear-driven thought that it certainly is a worthwhile topic to at least attempt to share some thoughts about. And take from this whatever might apply to you, because there's many different ways of looking at fear. One of the first things that I think about when I think about fear and how closely it is related to anger and all the negative things is just to think of the picture, which I've experienced myself, when you have young children and you're out in the yard and the children are playing, and all of a sudden a toddler or somebody fairly young, usually a toddler, somehow starts heading out for the street. And what does the mother do? She rushes after that child. And does she gently pick up that child and say, "Darling, it's not a good idea to go into the street because there's cars there, you might get..." No, she said, "Don't you ever go back into the street again. Do you realize there's cars out there? They could kill you." I mean, that's how fast, that is how fast fear, the fear of losing a child, can turn into anger. And we see that in our culture all around, that fear then leads to anger. And then when that anger keeps on boiling and boiling, it turns into hatred. And not just fear, but then hatred of the other, or hatred of what's different, or hatred of things that aren't the way we think they should be. And then, of course, there's self-righteous anger. That's the good one. We all enjoy that, because then we can say, not only is that thing wrong and it shouldn't have happened to us, but we can blame those people are morally corrupt, they're terrible, and so on and so forth. One of the examples that I printed out thanks to ChatGPT was examples of people defiling others in politics. This is from the 18th century. Thomas Jefferson, so-and-so is a hideous hermaphroditical character which has neither the force and firmness of a man nor the gentleness and sensibility of a woman. And Andrew Jackson, I cannot believe that killing 2,500 Englishmen in New Orleans qualifies somebody for the various and difficult, complicated duties of being a president. Benjamin Franklin, this is a man who is so wicked, he would tax his own mother's grave if given the chance. So, I mean, this kind of stuff has been around for a long time. It's part of the human condition. And I bring all of this up because I think, especially in spiritual communities, there is a lot of fear right now. And I think there's a special situation that applies especially to those of us who practice metaphysical thought. The joy of metaphysical thought is that spirit is expressing through you, and what you think, you can think and have the perfect boyfriend, or the perfect job, and so on and so forth. And especially back in the 80s, it was all about prosperity. You think about the right things, and you'll be wallowing in all kinds of money and whatever. But there's another side to that coin. It also means taking responsibility for our thoughts. The other kind of part of the coin that we don't always like to face so much is that we have also created and participate in whatever we see in front of us. And I think it behooves us, especially as metaphysical practitioners of spiritual principles, to recognize how when we act from fear and when we carry around fearful thoughts, we ourselves are contributing to the very thing that we don't want. And it's tricky. I can remember Reverend Phyllis used to say, well, do you believe in God? Well, then what are you worried about? That sounds so easy. However, we are human beings. We haven't yet graduated to the next awareness. We're down here having a physical human being experience. And sometimes we just need to do a little, like a pattern interrupt, because a lot of times all of these fear-based thoughts come from these elegant computers in our heads that are very negative biased because they were created to keep us out of trouble and away from saber-toothed tigers. And so with that negative bias, it's easy to look for those negative things. But as spiritual beings, sometimes we can get almost inundated by the negative thoughts. And as my dad used to say, he was an ordained Episcopalian minister, you cannot preach about sin unless you've experienced some. So we're all here, and if we were so spiritual, then why are we having all these worries, So there's this sort of duality between our brains and the negative bias of our brains that looks for all the negative things, and the spiritual side that wants peace and that knows that if we would focus more on peace and less on the fear, things would be so much better. We could take action instead of be victims in so many different cases. So what I was thinking about is sometimes we need that little, what people who practice NLP would say, that little pattern interrupt to just jiggle our brains a little. And it's not necessarily, and pardon me because I'm not going to be that spiritual today, we need something from the world of self-development. One of the most interesting things to me is since the late 1960s, early 70s, many of the great metaphysical teachers really started out from a very pragmatic point of view. And the first one that I came across before I ever thought of being a metaphysical practitioner, or realizing that there is a way of looking at the world and spirituality from a different point of view than the traditional Christian one that I was brought up in, was Wayne Dyer, Pulling Your Own Strings. Boy, it was like lights went on in my head. I was a mommy at that point. I was a mommy of 4 children, and women's lib had hit, so as soon as the youngest one was off to kindergarten, I was out the door. And I had my first job as a secretary. Because I thought that's the only thing you can do, you know. Anyway, that didn't last very long. It lasted for about a couple of months. Then it was on to other things. But anyway, I can remember that one of the things that would happen back in those days is that women would go out and they'd have this job, but they'd still keep up the role of being the mommy. So one of the things that used to really irritate the heck out of me is that I would go the trouble of doing the laundry and putting the laundry in, folding it up, putting it on each person's bed, because I had 4 children plus a husband, and they wouldn't put it away. And I would get, so here I was doing all this, and it was Wayne Dyer who made me start thinking, well, wait a minute, whose agenda is this really? And why don't I pull my own strings? And I went out to Central Hardware, got 5 laundry baskets, labeled them all, did the laundry, put the laundry in the baskets, and if the kids wanted to get dressed downstairs, that was fine with me. You know, in other words, taking responsibility. Instead of being a victim, turn around and say, well, start pulling your own strings instead of dancing around everybody else's strings. And that was my first wake-up call. And it was very interesting to me that as Wayne Dyer brought out each book, which became more and more and more spiritual, the same thing was happening. Is there other people in this room that happened to? It was like the same thing was happening to me. I discovered religious science, I discovered metaphysical thought, and so on and so forth. But I think that's one of the greatest contributions of metaphysical thought, is the idea that we are responsible. We can't just sit around and be victims. And I think sometimes in our culture, it can be easy to get lost in being a victim and being negative about things. So, a tool, I was looking around, well, what kind of a tool could somebody use to get themselves from just, you know, we have all the books, of course, but sometimes we need to get them out another time and read them. So I was looking for a tool, and I came across one of the books in my spiritual library, which is a book by Byron Katie called Loving What Is. And she really just really nails things down to taking responsibility to your thoughts. And I thought today what I would do is share her way of dealing with negative thoughts and fear. And I think that it is one way of helping ourselves get a little bit more presence with what's going on and to take a different tack. So, let's see. I'll look at my notes here. I had too many thoughts about this, so here's another example, and I'm going to just use it the way Byron Katie would do it. What she did was she had a set of 4 questions that she would ask people, and that she would invite people as far as, you know, their own self-examination. And it was a way of getting out of being a victim. And actually, the reason she wrote her first book was she actually got herself out of a very deep depression, and by practically living on the floor, and you know, she was in very dire straits, by asking these questions of herself. And I actually printed them out. I've got them in my briefcase over here, and anybody who wants those questions after the service, come and get them. So there's 4 questions. The first question is this really true? The second is, can you absolutely know this is true? And then the third question is, how do you react when you have this thought? And then the last one is, who would you be without this thought? So I'm going to use another example from being a young mother. We would go for vacation down to Lake of the Ozarks and rent one of those houseboats and all this kind of stuff. And at the end of the weekend, the long weekend, we would come home on a Sunday night. And there I would be in the front hallway. Everybody had dumped the laundry, the grocery bags, everything, all, and I would be fuming. just, doesn't anybody see that somebody has to take the laundry? And I would just, and I have to cook dinner and so on and so forth. And I would be full of that wonderful self-righteous anger. So here's what Byron Katie would say to me. She would say, is it really true that all these people are completely, ignorant of your needs? And I would say, well, yes, it's their responsibility. They should see that the laundry needs to be taken downstairs and we need to put things away and they need to be helping their mother instead of running off to talk to their friends and so on. The worst was my husband. He would go to his study and read the paper and catch up on the mail while I was standing there with all the stuff in the hall. Self-righteous anger. Ooh, it feels so good. So, Byron Katie, the first thing she would ask is, well, is this really true? That all of your children, and that they're just thoughtless, terrible creatures? Well, given by the evidence, they didn't care enough to take care of this. It's true. Well, can you absolutely know for sure that it's true? Well, it's not always true. There are times when they help and so on and so forth. And then the next question is, how would you react when you believe that thought? Well, when I believe that particular thought, that nobody cares about me, then I get all upset and pissed off. And it's not very productive. Well, then how would you be if you didn't have that thought? Well, maybe I could come up with some practical solutions. The practical solution was, whenever we came back from a trip after that, everybody would get directions as we came up the driveway. You're going to do this, you're going to do that, and so on and so forth. So I could get things done, and I was no longer wrapped up in the victim thing. Now, let's take it another step further. All of us know somebody, I'm sure, family member or somebody, who is really fearful about today's political climate. So let's go through those 4 questions just about that particular issue. So the person might say, oh, our country is falling apart. Well, is this really true? At first that person might say, well, yes, it is. Just look at the news. Look at what's going on. Well, is it completely true? Is every single aspect of our country going downhill? Are there no positive things happening? Well, that gives you pause to think, doesn't it? And then the second question, do you absolutely know it's true? Have there never been times where our country has suffered through other big crises and never come through? I think back to the Vietnam War. And those I think there was the students in Ohio at a protest who got shot by their own National Guard. I can think back to times when, well, I can't think, but I can remember my mother talking about times where it wasn't about the price of eggs. It was you were rationed only how much sugar and how much flour and so on and so forth you were allowed to purchase at the store, period, because we were at war. So, do we absolutely know that the country is doomed? Well, we've been able to come through quite a few other things. So then, the next Byron Katie question would be, how do you react when you believe that thought? We all become victims. We become paralyzed. We become caught up in all of the negative thought. And as spiritual beings, we're contributing to it. The stress doesn't really change the situation. It only makes the people who have those thoughts suffer. So, who would that person be without the thought that the country is doomed? Well, they could still care about politics, but without the weight of despair. And without that weight of despair, they can take action. And action is the best cure for fear. I read a lot of, or collect a lot of motivational quotes, especially for myself, because I'm starting a new business and it means calling up strangers and, getting appointments with them and so on and so forth. And a little thing that I have on my desk says, the very thing you fear is the key to your success. And I hate picking up the phone calling strangers, but that's what I mean. So, going through those questions, if you have friends who are thinking that the country is doomed, maybe those are good questions to think about, to consider. Because when we aren't burdened by that weight of despair and by being victims, then we can actually do something. And when we're doing something and making conscious choices, instead of being swept up in fear, we can be the change and the peace that we desire, a spiritual community. One last thought from Buddha. Buddha was walking along a mountainside, a little trail, and he was with two of his students. And they came across a great big boulder that had rolled across the trail. And Buddha said to the two students, "How much do you think this rock weighs?" And one said, "Oh, I think it weighs about 200 pounds. And the other one said, no, at least 500 or 600 pounds. And Buddha said, "This rock weighs nothing unless you choose to pick it up."